Sir Keir Starmer is now at the centre of what legal scholars and democracy advocates have described as the most audacious assault on democratic principles in a generation, a political and constitutional crisis that has stunned the nation and rocked Westminster. In an extraordinary legal development, the Prime Minister is facing judicial proceedings over claims that he masterminded a sweeping, authoritarian-style power grab, one that critics argue threatens the bedrock principles of free speech, voter representation, and electoral integrity. Did you know that over 95% of our viewers aren't subscribed to the channel? We totally get it, life gets busy, and sometimes it's easy to forget. But here's the thing, subscribing is completely free, and it really helps us keep creating the content you enjoy. So, why not hit that subscribe button and join our community? It only takes a second, but it makes a world of difference to us. Thank you for your support. What began quietly as a modest legal petition has since erupted into a full-blown national scandal. The case, now fast-tracked by the courts due to widespread public alarm, alleges a deliberate scheme involving the postponement of local elections, the disqualification of candidates, and a redrawing of regulations, all purportedly orchestrated to stifle the meteoric rise of Reform UK, the insurgent political force that has upended Britain's traditional political balance. This is no longer a routine matter of political contention. It is being framed as a high-stakes legal battle for the soul of British democracy. At the heart of the controversy lies Starmer's revised Devolution bill, a piece of legislation he publicly promoted as a bold step towards local empowerment, simplified governance, and enhanced community leadership. But critics argue that behind the polished rhetoric and media-friendly launches lurked a far more cynical agenda. The legislation was passed in the immediate aftermath of the 2025 local elections, during which Reform UK achieved sweeping gains, securing hundreds of council seats and gaining control of multiple areas historically held by Labour and the Conservatives. Instead of acknowledging the electorate's voice, Starmer's administration responded with what has been described as political retribution. Within a matter of days, key local governance bodies were dismantled. Elected councils were abruptly dissolved, and their powers were transferred, with minimal transparency, to newly established regional authorities, many of which are now overseen by unelected Labour loyalists. In areas where Reform UK had seen its strongest support, such as Lincolnshire, Staffordshire, and Kent, elections were suspended, council meetings were halted, and numerous candidates were disqualified under sudden, hastily introduced vetting rules. There was no parliamentary debate. No public consultation. Just a swift imposition of centralized political control cloaked in bureaucratic justification. The implicit message from Downing Street was chilling: vote the wrong way, and your vote may simply not count. Reform UK moved quickly. Its candidates were barred from standing in by-elections. Promising mayoral contenders were abruptly declared ineligible after failing opaque and subjective competency assessments. Entire constituencies where Reform UK was leading in the polls saw their elections cancelled under the guise of administrative reorganisation, while Labour-leaning areas proceeded without delay. The result, many argue, was a blatant double standard, one rule for those in power, another for everyone else. The public response was swift and furious. Protests broke out across towns in the Midlands and the North. What began as grassroots anger rapidly coalesced into organised opposition. A broad coalition comprising civil liberties organisations, former judges, local councillors, and Reform UK leaders has now mounted what legal observers are calling one of the most consequential challenges to a sitting Prime Minister in recent history. Their central claim is damning, that Keir Starmer abused state mechanisms to systematically undermine his political opponents, violating electoral law and core democratic principles in the process. This is not a fringe conspiracy or a partisan outcry. It is a formal legal case supported by a growing body of evidence. Internal party documents reportedly show Labour strategists convening in the wake of Reform UK's electoral surge to draft legal and procedural frameworks aimed at curbing the rival party's momentum. Leaked government memos appear to reveal efforts to redraw electoral boundaries in a manner that diluted Reform UK's areas of strength. Furthermore, the controversial new vetting criteria for local candidates are said to have been introduced post-2025 specifically to sideline the grassroots campaigners who helped fuel Reform's rise. The courts have now agreed to hear the case without delay, a highly unusual move for a matter of such political magnitude. The implications are potentially seismic. Should the judiciary determine that Starmer's devolution bill was wielded as a political weapon, it could trigger the collapse of the entire legislative framework. Elections may have to be rerun. Disqualified candidates could be reinstated. And the Prime Minister himself may face mounting calls to resign in disgrace. At the core of the case lies a profoundly unsettling question: can a British Prime Minister legally alter the rules of democracy to silence a rival they cannot defeat at the ballot box? Reform UK did not break the law. It did not subvert the system. It simply gained the support of ordinary Britons disillusioned with the status quo. For that, it now stands accused of being punished, shut out of elections, silenced in public discourse, and subjected to a campaign of procedural and political obstruction. The constitutional crisis engulfing Sir Keir Starmer's government came to a dramatic head in an unassuming Midlands town, the unlikely epicenter of a political scandal now gripping the nation. Earlier this year, local residents there had, for the first time, elected Reform UK councillors. There was a palpable sense of change, of hope. But that hope was swiftly extinguished. In April, a 62-year-old local man arrived at his polling station, only to discover that Reform UK had been removed from the ballot under new regional eligibility laws introduced under the controversial Devolution Act. Outraged yet composed, he filmed himself spoiling his ballot paper in protest. Speaking into his phone camera, he said simply, "This isn't democracy." Moments later, he was arrested. The charge? Breaching vague new public order provisions tied to the Devolution Act, laws that criminalize acts perceived to undermine public confidence in the electoral process. His video, uploaded moments before police seized his phone, went viral in a matter of hours. The arrest ignited a political firestorm. Protests erupted in over 40 towns. The man, an unremarkable figure in the best sense, a retired mechanic, grandfather, and lifelong resident, became an icon of resistance. His face appeared on placards and posters. His words echoed from loudspeakers at rallies across the country. Then came the whistleblower. A former civil servant involved in the implementation of the devolution reforms came forward with damning revelations. Leaked internal documents exposed direct instructions from the Prime Minister's office urging officials to manage areas where so-called non-mainstream parties were gaining traction, in other words, to suppress political opposition. The documents are now central to the ongoing legal challenge and are being described as clear evidence of state-sponsored electoral manipulation. This is not democracy defended. This is democracy distorted, rewritten to benefit a single party and a single man. As the legal battle begins in earnest, the entire nation is watching. Because this is no longer merely about Reform UK. It is a referendum on the integrity of British democracy itself. The gravity of the case cannot be overstated. Reform UK's legal team has reportedly secured irrefutable evidence showing that the Starmer government did not simply pass sweeping reforms, it orchestrated a calculated campaign to neutralise political opposition, planned and coordinated at the highest levels of Downing Street. What began as scattered allegations of electoral foul play has now erupted into a nationwide reckoning. This is no longer Reform UK's fight alone. It is now a question of democratic survival. At the heart of the controversy lies the Devolution Act, a piece of legislation initially marketed as a modernising reform of regional governance. In reality, it is now being unmasked as a Trojan horse for consolidating partisan control. Disillusionment has spread beyond traditional opposition circles. Discontent is emerging from unexpected quarters. Former Labour supporters, civil liberties campaigners, even Conservative MPs have broken ranks, calling for the Act's immediate suspension and a full parliamentary inquiry into what some are calling the gravest abuse of executive authority in modern British history. The catalyst for this eruption? The arrest of one elderly man who dared to record himself casting a protest vote after Reform UK was erased from the ballot. Though released without charge after 48 hours, his brief detention became a symbol of everything that now feels perilously wrong in British politics. Downing Street refused to apologise. Instead, it doubled down, insisting the man's actions threaten electoral integrity. But the public did not accept this narrative. What they saw was something else entirely, an ordinary citizen, arrested not for breaking the law, but for peacefully expressing dissent. The political fallout was immediate. Press briefings turned combative. Journalists demanded answers. Starmer appeared increasingly evasive and brittle. Why were reform-leaning districts disproportionately targeted with election delays and disqualifications? Why were campaigners being arrested simply for filming outside polling stations? Why were fundamental democratic processes being overseen by unelected regional authorities, many populated by known Labour affiliates? As public unrest intensified and legal scrutiny deepened, a deeper crisis began to emerge, one that even Starmer and his most trusted advisers did not appear to anticipate. This is no longer just a political scandal. It is a defining moment for the United Kingdom, a test of whether the principles of representative government, free expression, and equal participation can survive in the face of executive overreach. Reform UK may have lit the spark, but it is the nation's democratic conscience that now burns with fury. The question confronting Britain is stark and inescapable: can our democracy survive when those in power believe they can rewrite the rules to silence their challengers? As the scandal surrounding the Devolution Act reached fever pitch, the Labour Party itself began to buckle under the strain. What started as whispers of internal dissent soon evolved into a full-blown fracture. Leaked emails, anonymous briefings, and quiet expressions of discontent emerged from Labour heartlands, in Merseyside, Yorkshire, and Wales, regions once unwavering in their support for the party. But silence could not be maintained for long. During a heated session in the House of Commons, a respected Labour backbencher, long regarded as loyal, yet guided by principle, stood to deliver a quiet but damning call, a demand for an emergency internal review into the implementation of the Devolution Act. Though his tone was measured, the message was unmistakable: Labour could no longer justify the indefensible. The response was extraordinary. On the government benches, stunned silence. From the opposition, scattered applause. The backlash from Labour's traditional base was swift and uncompromising. Internal polling painted a grim picture. Support was hemorrhaging among key demographics: young voters, ethnic minority communities, and trade union members. In WhatsApp groups and backroom meetings, panic spread through the party's inner circle. "We've lost control of the story," read one leaked message. Another warned starkly, "If the court rules against us, we're finished." Concern was no longer theoretical. It was existential. Civil servants, too, began to speak out. Internal government memoranda showed that senior officials had issued multiple warnings to Downing Street, not only about the legal risks of postponing elections and disqualifying candidates, but also the catastrophic reputational damage it could cause. Those warnings were disregarded. In a desperate bid to contain the fallout, Labour launched a nationwide public relations campaign to defend the Devolution Act. But the effort backfired spectacularly. The media blitz, saturated with sympathetic Labour-aligned voices, was widely viewed as cynical and manipulative. Community leaders, many of whom had been loyal to the party for decades, condemned the campaign outright. "They want to tell us what's best for our communities," said one viral video, "but they won't even let us choose who represents us." As protests spread across the nation and the court date drew nearer, Labour itself began to fracture into factions. Some MPs remained steadfast in their support of Sir Keir Starmer. Others, more pragmatic, quietly began preparing the ground for a leadership challenge, hedging their bets in case the Prime Minister's position became untenable. Even Deputy Leader Angela Rayner, usually Starmer's most vocal and loyal ally, appeared to step back. Her conspicuous silence was interpreted by many as a calculated move. The signal was unmistakable: no one wanted to be too closely tied to a Prime Minister who might not survive the year. All attention now turned to the Royal Courts of Justice, where the legal challenge against the government was about to unfold. The courtroom was packed: journalists, political observers, campaigners, and everyday citizens gathered for what was fast becoming the most consequential constitutional trial in modern British history. The stakes could not have been higher. Was the Devolution Act merely a flawed but well-meaning reform, or was it part of a deliberate campaign to rig the political system in favour of the ruling party? On one side stood the government's legal team, armed with thick dossiers and lofty arguments about administrative modernisation and governance reform. On the other stood a diverse coalition: Reform UK candidates, civil liberties advocates, former judges, and local councillors, all united in their conviction that democracy itself was under threat. The lead barrister for the plaintiffs opened with a statement that silenced the room. This is not about local government. This is about whether elections in Britain can be manipulated to serve the political ambitions of a single man. The evidence that followed was devastating. Leaked internal memos revealed the government had pushed the devolution reforms through with full knowledge that they would disproportionately harm Reform UK. Whistleblower testimony confirmed that candidate disqualifications were not incidental, but deliberate and targeted. And then came audio recordings, captured during private Labour strategy meetings, in which officials discussed methods for minimising Farage's footprint by redrawing constituency boundaries. For the first time in months, the government had lost control of the narrative. It now belonged to the judiciary, the very institution Sir Keir Starmer's administration had attempted to reshape. What had begun as a legal challenge had become something more profound, a national reckoning. A test of whether the values Britain claims to hold dear, fairness, transparency, democratic integrity, still hold any real meaning in the face of raw political ambition. The final outcome remains uncertain. The court's ruling is yet to be delivered. But one truth is now undeniable: Sir Keir Starmer, once heralded as a restorer of political integrity, now stands accused of presiding over one of the gravest betrayals of democratic principles in a generation. The argument laid bare by the plaintiffs was clear and unflinching: this was not devolution. It was a bureaucratic coup. Labour's legal team attempted to defend the sweeping changes as necessary administrative reforms, citing urban sprawl, failing councils, and regional inequality. But few were convinced. What the public saw was not reform, but retribution. Not efficiency, but engineered control. And as the trial moves forward, Britain holds its breath, waiting to see whether democracy will prevail, or whether it has already been compromised beyond repair. The High Court proceedings had been tense, but as the final arguments concluded, it became clear that the judiciary was unconvinced by the government's defense. One judge, with barely veiled skepticism, asked, if this is truly about fairness, why were election timelines altered without even a single parliamentary debate? Another pressed further, why, then, were Labour-affiliated regions mysteriously exempt from these new restrictions and electoral audits? Outside the courtroom, the national mood had grown increasingly volatile. Protesters amassed in their thousands, clutching placards bearing slogans such as, "Let us vote," and "No more rigging." Rolling news coverage broadcast live updates to millions, as what had begun as a legal battle now became a full-blown political reckoning. And then came the verdict. In a unanimous ruling, the High Court struck down key provisions of the Devolution Act. The judgment was emphatic: no government, regardless of its majority, could rewrite the rules of democracy in order to marginalize political opposition. All elections that had been postponed were to be reinstated immediately. All previously disqualified Reform UK candidates were cleared to stand. Most significantly, the court ordered a formal investigation into the Labour government's conduct, a potential precursor to criminal or parliamentary consequences. The reaction was immediate and seismic. Outside the Royal Courts of Justice, jubilant crowds erupted into cheers. Political analysts described the ruling as a watershed moment, a definitive line in the sand for British democracy. It was not simply a legal defeat for Labour. It was a symbolic dismantling of Keir Starmer's authority. Westminster plunged into chaos within minutes. Opposition leaders united in calling for Starmer's resignation. Reform UK leader Nigel Farage, speaking at an emergency press conference, declared, "We warned the British people. We stood firm. Now the courts have confirmed it. This government has no respect for democracy." Across the country, Labour constituency offices were flooded with furious calls and emails. Resignations from party members surged. Labour MPs in marginal seats scrambled to distance themselves from the leadership. Some even crossed the floor to support the formation of a new parliamentary bloc demanding early general elections and comprehensive democratic reforms. Yet perhaps the most profound wound was psychological. For months, the public had been told that the Devolution Act represented nothing more than modernisation, a path to more efficient governance. Now the judiciary had exposed it as a vehicle for political entrenchment. Trust, already strained, was now shattered. Newspapers turned sharply. Front pages were unrelenting. Labour's legal humiliation, read one. Another headline thundered, "The day democracy fought back." One particular line from the High Court's ruling was repeated endlessly on television and radio. Democracy must not only function. It must be seen to function. That phrase echoed across the nation, from Parliament to high streets, from pubs to dinner tables. Within days, Starmer's grip on power was visibly disintegrating. His credibility wasn't simply questioned. It was dismantled, in real time, by judges, journalists, and his own party. Labour's internal unity collapsed. Senior figures who had once stood loyally behind the Prime Minister began to turn against him. Cabinet meetings, previously choreographed displays of discipline, degenerated into shouting matches. The resignations came swiftly, first from junior ministers, then from prominent frontbenchers. Lisa Nandy, Wes Streeting, and other rising stars began issuing statements distancing themselves from the reforms. One backbench MP, speaking live on air, captured the moment succinctly: "I didn't come into politics to defend authoritarianism." Starmer, under immense pressure, attempted to regain control. He called a hastily arranged press conference, pledging to respect the court's decision and promising internal reforms. But his tone was robotic, his delivery strained. Journalists pounced, asking about leaked memos, the real motives behind the act, and the exodus of support. One reporter posed the fatal question: "If your own party doesn't trust you, why should the country?" Starmer froze. No answer could undo what had occurred. The revolt deepened.